They say grief makes you feel like you're living in another world, a hollowed-out copy of the one you knew, where everything looks the same but feels fundamentally wrong. They don't tell you what to do when you discover that you actually are. My name is Elias Vance, and this is the log of how my world and everyone in it was diagnosed as an error. It began with a sound that wasn't a sound, and a city under the ice that wore my home's face. This is the story of Quarup Station, and the day reality came to correct itself. The universe, as far as I was concerned, was made of three things: the hum, the cold, and the ache. The hum was the station, the constant, life-sustaining thrum of the generators, the air cyclers, the heaters, the mechanical heartbeat I was paid to keep beating. The cold was the Antarctic continent, a god of absolute indifference that pressed in on every inch of our metal shell, always waiting for a moment of weakness. And the ache was mine alone. It lived in my chest, a permanent resident that had moved in the day I lost Sarah. My alarm screamed at 6:00, a digital shriek that cut through the low thrum of my quarters. I slapped it silent and sat up, the deck plates cold enough to steal my breath. Outside my porthole, nothing, just the swirling pre-dawn grey of the polar night. Another cycle. In the shared washroom, I stared at my face in the polished steel mirror, deep-set eyes, a latticework of fine lines around them from squinting at wiring diagrams, and a beard I'd let grow to save the trouble of shaving. I looked like a man running on fumes, which wasn't far from the truth. My job was maintenance chief, a fancy title for being the sole grease monkey and glorified handyman for the 12 souls stuck at Quarup Research Station. While the scientists chased cosmic rays and drilled for million-year-old ice cores, I kept the lights on and the toilets flushing. It was honest work. It was lonely work. It was exactly what I needed. Elias, Dr. Aristhorne's voice crackled over my personal comms as I was wrestling with a stubborn coolant line on Generator 3. Her tone had its usual clipped efficiency, like she was conserving vowels to save on bandwidth. Hydroponics is reporting a temperature drop. Bay Gamma is flashing amber alerts. On my way, Doc, I grunted, wiping grease from my hands onto an already filthy rag. Tell the lettuce to put on a sweater. There was a dry click as she disconnected. Eris was our lead geophysicist, a woman who seemed more comfortable with seismic data than with people. She saw the world in waveforms and strata, and I was just another piece of loud, unpredictable machinery. The hydroponics bay was an oasis of startling green in our world of gray steel and white ice. The air was warm, humid, and smelled of damp earth and chlorophyll. But as I entered Bay Gamma, the chill was noticeable. The indicator panel on the main growth unit was blinking a steady, accusatory yellow. "It's the primary heating coil again," I muttered to myself, popping open the access panel. Inside was a rat's nest of conduits and regulators. My predecessor had a love for jury rigging that bordered on the artistic. For an hour, I was lost. The world shrank to the tip of my multimeter, the delicate task of bypassing the faulty coil without frying the entire environmental control board. It was in moments like this I found a sliver of peace. There were no messy emotions in a broken circuit. There was only a problem and a solution. I rerouted the power, crimped a new connection and sealed the panel. The amber light died, replaced by a steady green. The low whir of the heaters kicked in with renewed vigor. I was packing up my tools when Aris walked in, tablet in hand. She glanced at the green light, then at me. A flicker of something, approval maybe, crossed her face before being suppressed. Fixed. "For now," I said, standing up and feeling my knees pop. "The whole unit is a patchwork. It needs a full rebuild, which we can't do until the summer crew arrives with the parts." "Patchwork is your specialty, isn't it?" she said. It wasn't quite an insult, but it wasn't a compliment either. She tapped on her tablet, her focus already elsewhere. "The core samples from the deep drill are showing unprecedented density at the 3,000-meter mark. We're pushing into ice that hasn't seen the sun in 2 million years. Hope you find something interesting," I said, meaning it. Her discoveries justified our being here, which justified my paycheck, which justified the endless aching emptiness of my life. It was a fragile chain of logic. But it was all I had. "We always do," she replied, her eyes glued to the screen. "The past is never truly buried, Elias. It's just compressed. She walked away, leaving me alone with the quiet hum of the newly repaired heater and the scent of living plants. I wished the past could stay buried. Mine certainly felt compressed, a black diamond of grief lodged right under my sternum. The event happened at 13:47 during midday meal. The mess hall was half full. I was halfway through a bowl of rehydrated chili, listening to two biologists argue about penguin mating habits. It was a moment of profound, boring normalcy, and then the world cracked. It wasn't a sound, not in the way you hear a sound with your ears. It was a feeling, a pressure, a high-frequency something that bypassed the air and drilled directly into your skull. It was the psychic equivalent of a tuning fork being struck against your soul. A sharp, resonant, crystalline crack that vibrated behind the eyes and in the fillings of your teeth. My spoon clattered from my hand. Across the table, Chen, one of the biologists, yelped and grabbed his temples. The entire station didn't shake. The structure didn't groan. But for one silent, terrible second, it felt as though reality itself had fractured. And then it was over. Silence. A deeper silence than before, as if that single internal noise had swallowed all other sound. "What the hell was that?" someone whispered. Before anyone could answer, the alarms blared. Not the fire alarm, not the depressurization alarm, but the general alert klaxon, a harsh, rhythmic whooping reserved for station-wide, unidentified emergencies. Commander Thorne's voice, usually a calm baritone, boomed over the intercom, tight with tension. "All hands to briefing. That's all hands. Now. Seismic is reporting a major surface event." We scrambled to the command center, a room bristling with monitors and blinking lights. Thorne stood before the main view screen, his face pale. Aris was at the seismic console, her fingers flying across the keyboard, her expression a mixture of terror and manic excitement. "Report," Thorne commanded. "It wasn't an earthquake," Aris said, not looking up. "No P waves, no S waves. The seismographs registered a single instantaneous shear event. It's physically impossible. But look." She projected the data onto the main screen. A topographical map of the region around our station was displayed. A thick, angry red line now sliced through it, running for miles, passing less than a kilometer from our position. "A fissure," I breathed. "A massive one. It's over 200 meters wide at the epicenter," Aris said. "And the depth is, we can't get a reading. Ground-penetrating radar is being absorbed. It's like it goes on forever." "Send the drone," Thorne ordered. "I want to see what's down there." That was my cue. The heavy exploration drone, Karen, was my responsibility. Within 20 minutes, I had it prepped on the launch platform, its high-intensity floodlights cutting through the perpetual gloom. We all gathered back in the command center, the room dark except for the glow of the screens. The main view was now a live feed from Karen's forward camera. "Launching," the drone operator announced. The drone lifted off and sped towards the fissure. The camera feed was a nauseating swirl of white snow and grey sky. Then the ground simply vanished. The drone tipped forward, its lights plunging into an abyss of absolute black. "Begin descent." Thorne's voice was a low murmur. Charon descended into the crack. The jagged walls of ice and rock flew past 100 meters apart, then 200. The scale was mind-boggling. This wasn't a crack. It was a canyon carved in an instant. "What's the atmospheric reading?" Aris asked, her voice tight. "That's the thing, Doc," the operator replied, his eyes wide. "Pressure is stable. Temperature is holding at a steady -5 Celsius. That shouldn't be possible. It should be getting colder. And composition is sterile. No microbes, no airborne particles, nothing." The silence in the room deepened. We were staring at a violation of basic geology and biology. Down and down the drone went. 500 meters, 1,000. The walls of the fissure were now smooth, almost polished. "Bringing floodlights to maximum," the operator said. The world on the screen bloomed with brilliant white light. And there it was. Something that didn't belong. It wasn't rock. It was a structure. The lights reflected off a surface of perfectly smooth, non-reflective black metal. It was the top of a tower, an impossible spire rising from the depths. A collective gasp went through the room. "An artifact," Aris whispered, her voice filled with a terrifying awe. "Elias, get a close-up. I need to see the material composition if I can. Move in closer, Thorne ordered the operator. Follow the structure down. I want to know what it's attached to. The drone obeyed, spiraling slowly downwards, keeping the impossible black tower in frame. It was huge, monolithic, without seam or joint. It didn't look built, it looked grown. As we descended further, more of the structure came into view. Other shapes, angles, a long, flat expanse connected to the tower. My heart began to hammer in my chest. There was a familiarity to the shape that I couldn't place, a nagging sense of déjà vu that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Turn left around that corner, I said, my voice hoarse. I don't know why I said it, it was an instinct. Do it, Thorne commanded. The drone pivoted. Its lights swept across the blackness, illuminating a new part of the structure, a cylindrical module with small dark circles spaced evenly along its length. The living quarters, a large domed roof further on, the geolab, and connecting them all, a network of enclosed corridors. A wave of nausea and vertigo washed over me. It was all there. The comms array, the generator housing, the vehicle bay, every single detail. On the screen, bathed in the drone's sterile light, buried under 2 kilometers of ancient ice, was a city, and that city was Quarup Station. It was a perfect 1.1 scale replica. But it was wrong. It was dead. The metal was a light-devouring black. The windows were vacant, opaque voids. There were no lights, no movement, no life. It was our home, rendered as a colossal, silent tombstone. The operator let out a choked sound and pulled back on the controls. The drone's camera tilted up wildly, showing our own station, a tiny speck of light and life on the edge of the abyss, and then back down to its dark, silent twin sleeping in the ice below. The silence in the command center was louder and more terrifying than any alarm. We weren't looking at a discovery. We were looking at a paradox. We were staring into a mirror that had been buried for 2 million years, and we had no idea what was about to stare back. We should have left it buried. We should have filled that fissure with every ounce of explosives we had and run, but we didn't. And now it's too late. If you want to understand the horror we unleashed, if you need to know what happened when we decided to go down there, make sure you subscribe and hit that like button, because the story of what we found inside our own grave is just beginning. The image on the main screen didn't flicker. It didn't waver. It just sat there, a silent, black testament to the impossible. For a full minute, the only sound in the Quarup command center was the frantic thumping of my own heart against my ribs. We were staring at our own ghost. Commander Thorne was the first to break the spell. He straightened up, his knuckles white where he gripped the back of a chair. He was a former military man, and his training kicked in, smothering the initial shock under layers of rigid protocol. "Analysis," he barked, his voice a low growl that cut through the stunned silence. Dr. Aris Thorne, no relation to the commander but sharing his iron will, responded first, her voice a shaky whisper. "It's a perfect topographical match. The dimensions, the layout, it's identical. The material composition is inconclusive. It's absorbing all sensor readings. It's the blackest black I've ever seen, a complete energy sink. Is it a reflection? Some kind of geological mirage? A lensing effect in the ice?" Thorne threw out possibilities, his mind desperately seeking a rational anchor. Aris shook her head slowly, her eyes never leaving the screen. "No, the drone is physically maneuvering around it. It has mass. It's there. And Commander, based on the stratigraphy of the fissure walls, that structure has been down there for a minimum of 8 million years. The number hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. A copy of our state-of-the-art research station, which had been completed a mere decade ago, had been waiting under 2 kilometers of ice since the Pleistocene epoch. The very concept was an assault on logic, an act of chronological violence. "We are going down there," Thorne announced. A wave of protest erupted. It was madness. It was a breach of every safety protocol. But Thorne held up a hand, silencing the room. "This is no longer a research mission," he said, his eyes scanning each of our faces. "This is a matter of planetary significance. We are the only 12 human beings who know this thing exists. We cannot ignore it. We have a duty to investigate. His gaze landed on me. Elias, I need you and Chen on the primary expedition team. I want you to assess the structure, its power systems, if any, and its integrity. Chen, you'll run atmospheric and biological sampling. My blood ran cold. Commander, with all due respect, we don't know what that is. Sending a team down is an unacceptable risk. The unacceptable risk, Thorne countered, his voice dangerously low, is sitting up here blind, while an impossibility sits on our doorstep. You are going, that's an order. Aris, you'll coordinate from command. Lena, you'll be on medical standby. Gear up. We leave in 1 hour. There was no arguing. The mood as we prepared was grim, like soldiers before a charge. Chen, a usually jovial biochemist, was pale and silent as we loaded sample kits and sensors onto the motorized winch platform. I was in charge of the equipment, the comms, the lighting, the life support packs. My hands felt clumsy, my mind replaying the image of that dead station. Every bolt I tightened, every power pack I checked, felt like a nail in my own coffin. We assembled at the edge of the fissure, the three of us, Thorne, Chen and me, strapped into the harnesses on the winch platform. The air was thin and bit at any exposed skin. The fissure was a wound in the world, exhaling a palpable cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was a coldness of age and depth. Comms check. Aris's voice crackled in our helmets, unnaturally clear. Check, Thorne replied. Check, Chen mumbled. I'm here, I said, my voice tight. Platform is secure. Let's get this over with. With a low groan of stressed metal, the winch began our descent. The real Quarup station shrank above us, a tiny, fragile island of light and warmth. Then it was gone, and we were swallowed by the chasm. The drone, Karen, descended with us, its floodlights casting long, distorted shadows against the ice walls. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The rumble of the winch and the hiss of our suit regulators were the only sounds, but beyond that, there was a profound, oppressive stillness. It wasn't the absence of sound. It felt like the active suppression of it. As we dropped deeper, even the crackle on the comms seemed to thin out, the space between words growing heavy. After a descent that felt like an eternity, the echo station resolved itself out of the gloom below. It was even more monstrous up close. The black metal seemed to drink the powerful beams of our lights, giving nothing back. It was a hole in the shape of a building. The platform touched down with a soft, soundless thud on the roof of what should have been the main command module. We're down, Thorne reported, his voice strained. Elias, power up the portable floodlights. I unhooked the tripods and flipped the switches. The powerful LED lamps flickered to life, casting a sterile white glare over our immediate surroundings. And that's when we saw the dust. The entire surface of the station was coated in a fine black powder, as fine as soot, but without the texture. It lay in a perfectly undisturbed layer, inches thick in some places. When Chen took a step, his boot sank into it, but it didn't crunch like snow or puff up like dust. It simply unyielded, deadening the sound of his movement completely. What is this stuff? Chen whispered, kneeling to scoop a sample into a vial. Don't know, I said, my own boots sinking into the silent black carpet. It was like walking on powdered nothing. Let's find the main airlock. It should be 20 meters from this position. We moved across the rooftop, our footsteps making no sound. It was the most unsettling sensation, like we were ghosts floating over the skin of this dead place. We found the airlock where it was supposed to be. The outer door was closed. No external power source, I reported, running a scanner over the control panel. It's completely inert. I'll have to cut it open. I unslung my plasma cutter. The tool, which usually roared to life with a blinding hiss, produced only a soft, whisper-thin jet of blue flame. The oppressive silence of this place seemed to be affecting our technology, our physics. The cutter sliced through the metal of the door with unnerving ease, peeling it back like foil. There was no shower of sparks, just a silent, glowing line. The inner airlock door was also closed. I cut through that one too. As the final section of metal fell away with a quiet thump into the black dust, we were met with a puff of stale, cold air. Chen's handheld atmospheric sensor chirped. Nitrogen, oxygen, argon. The mix is almost identical to ours, he said, baffled. but it's sterile, utterly biologically sterile, and the temperature is -5 degrees Celsius, same as outside. The station isn't heated, I stated the obvious. No life support. Thorne nodded grimly. Helmets stay on. We move in. Stick together. Elias, lead the way to engineering. I want to see the generators. Stepping inside was like stepping into a memory. Every corridor, every junction was a perfect match, but it was a faded, dead photograph of a memory. The lights were off. Our helmet lamps cut sharp, lonely beams through the absolute darkness. The silence in here was even more profound. We could hear our own breathing, our own heartbeats, loud and intrusive in the dead stillness. And the dust was everywhere. It coated the floors, the walls, the control panels. It had settled on everything like a funeral shroud. I ran a gloved hand along a railing. The dust was cool and impossibly fine, leaving a perfect black smear on my glove. We reached the entrance to the engineering bay, my domain. The door was sealed. I keyed in the override code I used a dozen times a day. The panel beside the door was dark, but to my astonishment, the door hissed open with a faint pneumatic sigh. There's residual pressure in the hydraulic system, I whispered, more to myself than to the others. That's impossible after any length of time. The generator room was a cavern of silent, monolithic shapes. My generators, my big, loud, greasy machines. Here they were just cold black sculptures. I walked up to Generator 3, the very machine I had been working on just hours before. I ran my light over its casing, and there on the access panel was a fresh scorch mark near the manual release latch, a mark I had made myself that very morning when my wrench slipped. I felt a dizzying wave of vertigo. This wasn't just a copy. This place was connected to us. The details were too perfect, too recent. "Commander," Chen's voice crackled over the comms, tight with panic. He and Thorne had moved on to the medical bay while I was in engineering. "You need to see this." I left the silent generators and hurried through the soundless corridors, my light bobbing frantically. I found them in the infirmary. Thorne was standing rigid, and Chen was bent over the medical computer terminal, which was strangely illuminated with a faint, ghostly light. "The terminal has power," Chen said, his voice trembling. "I don't know how. It's not connected to anything. The battery is a solid, inert block. But it's on. On the screen were the station's medical files. Our files. My name was there, Elias Vance. Status, healthy. Chen's name was there. Thorne's name was there. But there were other entries, 12 of them, dated decades in the future." He scrolled down. My name appeared again, Elias Vance. Status, deceased. My gaze shot to the line below it. Cause of death, ontological collapse. My breath hitched. Chen scrolled further. Lena Hansen. Cause of death, symmetrical failure. Aris Thorne. Cause of death, terminal exposure to n-dimensional space. James Thorne. Cause of death, redundancy purge. The terms were meaningless, a terrifying techno-jargon from a cosmic horror novel. They weren't medical diagnoses. They were sentences handed down by a mad god. "What is this?" Thorne demanded, his voice barely a whisper. "A joke?" "This is no joke," I said, my own voice feeling distant. I felt a sudden, overpowering need to go to my quarters. A pull, a cold dread that knew exactly where to lead me. "I'll be right back." I left them staring at the impossible screen and navigated the familiar layout in the dark. I found my room. My name was on the door plate, the letters perfectly replicated. The door was unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped inside. It was my room, my small, cluttered personal space. The bed was neatly made. The worn copy of Moby Dick was on the small nightstand. A framed photo of Sarah and me on our wedding day stood beside it. I walked towards it, my boots sinking into the silent black dust on the floor. I picked up the photo. The frame was cold as ice. The smiling faces behind the glass seemed a million miles away. My hands were trembling. I set the photo down and opened the drawer of the nightstand. The drawer where I kept a few personal effects, a spare multi-tool, and the painful mementos I couldn't bring myself to throw away. But the drawer was almost empty. It contained only a single object, resting on a bed of the fine black powder. It was a silver watch, a delicate antique women's wristwatch with a small crack in the crystal at the 7 o'clock position. Sarah's watch, the one she was wearing when she died, the one I had held in my hand at her funeral before placing it in the coffin with her, just before they lowered it into the cold earth of a cemetery 6,000 miles away from here. I stared at it, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. I didn't touch it, I couldn't. The sight of it here in this impossible place broke something inside me. The ache in my chest, the one I had carried for years, erupted into a supernova of pure sanity-shredding horror. This place didn't just know our station, it knew me, it knew my grief. A frantic shout from Thorn came over the comms, snapping me out of my trance. "Elias, Chen, get back to the airlock now, we are leaving!" I stumbled out of the room, leaving the watch in its dusty tomb, and ran through the dead, silent hallways. I found Thorn and Chen back at the entrance, their lights pointed at the command center door. "What is it? What's wrong?" I panted, my breath fogging the inside of my helmet. "The security monitors," Thorn said, his voice ragged. "They flickered on, just for a second." He pointed a shaky finger at a bank of monitors visible through the command center's main window. They were dark now. "We were about to head back to the airlock," Chen stammered, "and they all lit up. They were showing live feeds of this station, of us. There was a feed for the corridor we just came down," Thorn continued, his light beam dancing nervously over the empty hall behind us. "And there was something on it, standing right where we were a minute ago." "What?" I asked, a cold dread coiling in my stomach. "What was it?" "I don't know," Thorn whispered. "It was indistinct. A flicker, like a human-shaped smudge of heat haze or TV static. It was there for a second, watching us, and then the screens went dead." We stood there, the three of us, frozen at the entrance to this dead copy of our home. We were miles from safety, surrounded by an impossible architecture and a silence that ate sound. And we were no longer certain that we were alone. The emptiness we now knew had eyes. There was no thought, only instinct. Thorn's order to retreat was a starting pistol shot into our paralyzed minds. We didn't run, we scrambled, a panicked three-person stampede through corridors that were both intimately familiar and monstrously alien. Every dark corner, every silent doorway, held the phantom image of that flickering, static-wrought figure. The oppressive silence of the echo station was no longer empty. It was watchful. It pressed in on us, a physical weight on our shoulders, and I had the suffocating certainty that it was enjoying our fear. We reached the airlock, the hole I had cut in its side a jagged, smiling mouth. Thorn and Chen practically threw themselves through it. I was the last one out, and as I turned to follow, my helmet light swept across the interior of the dead station one last time. For a single, heart-stopping moment, I thought I saw it. Deep in the corridor leading to the command center, a flicker of movement. Not a shape, but a distortion. A brief, oily shimmer in the air, like heat rising from asphalt, that resolved into nothingness as soon as I focused on it. I didn't wait for a second look. We clipped into the winch platform with fumbling, numb fingers. "Aris, get us out of here! Now!" Thorn yelled into his comm, his voice cracking. The ascent began with a jolt. The dead station fell away beneath us, its perfect dark geometry shrinking back into the abyss. I didn't take my eyes off it, half expecting to see that shimmering figure emerge from the airlock to watch us go. The drone, Karen, ascended with us, its lights keeping the silent structure illuminated until it was just a black shape in a blacker void, and then it was gone. The journey back to the surface was a climb from the grave. As we neared the top, the first true sounds from the outside world began to filter through the winch's vibrations. The distant howl of the wind across the ice, the groan of the winch motor under strain. After the absolute soul-crushing quiet below, the sounds of the living world were a physical assault. When the platform finally breached the surface and settled onto the ice, and I opened my helmet's visor, the cacophony of life, the wind, the hum of our own station's power, the frantic shouts of the surface team, was so overwhelming it drove me to my knees. It was the most beautiful and terrifying noise I had ever heard. We were rushed to the infirmary, stripped of our gear, and put under immediate quarantine. The debriefing happened through a plexiglass wall, with a shaken but resolute Commander Thorn recounting the events to the senior staff. He spoke of the station's perfect replication, the impossible age, the sterile environment. He didn't mention the medical files or the static figure on the monitor, and I didn't mention the watch. How could I? How do you tell your commanding officer that a dead city beneath the ice knows your most intimate sorrows and has access to the graves of your loved ones? Chen, however, was not so composed. He was rambling, his words tumbling over each other. He held up the sample vial, which was filled with the fine black powder from the station floor. The dust. "It's not dust," he stammered, his eyes wide with a frantic energy. "The spectrometer can't read it. It has no chemical signature. It has no mass. I put it on the gravimetric scale and the reading is 0. It's a physical object with no discernible properties. It's a contradiction. It's just... there." Aris listened, her face a mask of intense concentration. She wasn't scared. She was galvanized. She saw not a threat, but the ultimate scientific puzzle. "We have to go back down," she insisted. "The data. A substance with no mass, a structure that violates causality. This is bigger than anything in human history." "Absolutely not," Thorne shot back, his authority returning. "That place is hostile. The entire fissure is to be considered a containment zone. No one goes near it. We report this to command and let them decide." But we couldn't report it. Petrov, our comms officer, delivered the news an hour later. "All channels are dead, Commander. Long-range, short-range, satellite uplinks, everything. It's not just static. It's silence. The spectrum is flat. It's like the rest of the world just turned off." The contamination began that evening. It was subtle, insidious. I was back in my own quarters, my real, warm, noisy quarters, trying to scrub the phantom chill of the echo station from my bones. I was cleaning my tools, a mindless, repetitive task. I reached for my magnetic driver, but my hand met empty air. I frowned. I always kept it in the third slot of my toolkit. I looked, and the slot was empty. Annoyed, I stood up to check my workbench, and there it was, sitting perfectly centered on the bench, the magnetic driver. But beside it, nestled in the third slot of the toolkit I had left on my bunk, was the driver I had been reaching for. I was looking at 2 of them. 2 identical tools, right down to the small greasy thumbprint I had left on the handle of one of them, that very afternoon. I stared, my mind refusing to compute. I slowly reached out and picked up the one from the bench. It felt solid, real. I looked back at the toolkit. The other one was still there. I blinked and it was gone. The slot was empty again. I staggered back, my heart pounding. I was hallucinating. The stress, the shock. It had to be. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing the heels of my palms into them until I saw stars. The glitches spread. During the next meal period, Lena, our physician, complained that her coffee was stone cold the instant she poured it. Petrov swore he saw the main corridor stretch out to an impossible length for a split second, before snapping back to normal. These were small things, easily dismissed as tricks of the eye, products of frayed nerves and exhaustion. We were a crew under immense pressure, trapped in isolation with a terrifying secret. Of course, we were seeing things, but then the sensory failures became more personal, more undeniable. I was in the washroom, splashing cold water on my face. I looked up at my reflection in the polished steel mirror, and my reflection was slow. I raised my right hand, and for a half second the man in the mirror did nothing. Then his hand moved, mimicking my own in a lazy, lagging motion. I froze, my hand still in the air. The reflection froze. I lowered my hand slowly. The reflection followed, always a beat behind. It was like watching a video with a bad connection. I was out of sync with myself. I stared into my own reflected eyes, and they stared back with a horrifying, disconnected emptiness. I backed away from the mirror, a primal scream caught in my throat. I wasn't the only one. Aris confided in me later that day, her scientific composure finally cracking. "My left hand," she whispered, holding it up. "It doesn't feel like mine, Elias. I know it is. I can move it. I can feel with it. But it feels foreign, like a prosthetic I'm still learning to use." The paranoia started to curdle the atmosphere in the station. People began avoiding each other, casting suspicious glances. Conversations were held in hushed tones. The station's familiar hum, the mechanical heartbeat I knew so well, began to seem different. There were gaps in it, moments of profound, unnatural silence that would last for a second or two before the noise rushed back in. During these moments of absolute quiet, the air would feel thick, heavy, and cold. It was the silence of the abyss, bleeding through into our world. The true horror, however, manifested on the third day. I was walking towards the mess hall and saw Petrov heading the other way down the corridor. "Hey, Pete," I called out. He turned. "Elias," he said. And his voice, it was wrong. There was no inflection, no warmth. It was a flat, monotonous sound, like a primitive text-to-speech program. But that wasn't what made me stop dead. It was his face. He was smiling, but the expression was incomplete. The skin on his face was too smooth, like polished wax. There were no fine lines around his eyes, no pores, no subtle imperfections that make a human face real. His eyes themselves were just dark, flat circles, lacking the depth and complexity of a living person's. It was as if a sculptor had roughed out the basic shape of his face, but had gotten bored and walked away before adding any of the details. He was a low-resolution version of a man. "Is there a problem?" the flat voice inquired from the unfinished face. I couldn't speak. I just stared, my mind reeling. This was no hallucination. This was real. This was Petrov. But he was fading, being undone. No problem, I managed to choke out, and I pushed past him, my shoulder brushing his. He felt solid, but at the same time, strangely insubstantial. I burst into the mess hall, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The room was empty. The silence in here was deep, one of the auditory voids that had been plaguing the station. The air was frigid, and I noticed something on the main wall, the one we used for projecting movies on Saturday nights. A dark smudge that hadn't been there before. As I watched, the smudge grew. Thin black lines snaked out from it like frost crystallizing on a window pane. It was the dust, the impossible, massless black dust from the Echo station. It was writing on our wall. The lines intersected, forming sharp, angular letters, a stark black script against the sterile white of the wall. It formed a sentence, a simple, declarative statement of cosmic intent that froze the marrow in my bones and extinguished the last embers of hope in my soul. The power to the station chose that moment to flicker, plunging the room into absolute, pitch-black darkness. The emergency lights were supposed to kick in instantly, but for a long, drawn-out second, there was nothing. Only me, the cold, the total silence, and the chilling certainty of the words I had just read. Then the red emergency light stuttered to life, bathing the room in a hellish, pulsing glow. The message was still there on the wall, stark and clear, a judgment written in the powder of non-existence. A copy must be erased. It was not a warning, it was a diagnosis. And we were the disease. We were not the discoverers of an anomaly buried in the ice. We were the anomaly. And the universe had just issued a recall. For a long moment I was trapped in the pulsing, blood-red glow of the emergency lights, a statue carved from fear. The message on the wall wasn't just written, it was a declaration of war from reality itself. It recontextualized everything. We weren't haunted. We were a bug in the system, a duplicated file flagged for deletion. My paralysis broke, and I bolted from the mess hall. The main corridor was a nightmarish tunnel of alternating red light and deep shadow. The brief total silences were more frequent now, auditory black holes that swallowed the frantic pounding of my own boots on the deck plates. During one of these voids, I saw Lena, the station physician, stumble out of the infirmary, her face a mask of disbelief. "Elias," she gasped as the sound rushed back in. "My instruments, they're malfunctioning. The EKG is reading a flat line even when I'm hooked up to it. The digital microscope shows nothing. The slides are blank. It's like the concept of biology is ceasing to function in that room." Before I could respond, Thorne and Aris rounded the far corner, their faces illuminated by the strobing red lights. Thorne was holding a service pistol. Aris was clutching a tablet, her expression one of manic, terrified focus. "The message in the mess hall." Thorne's voice was strained, each word an effort. Everyone saw it on the security feeds before the main power cut out. The rest of the crew, all who were left, began to emerge from their rooms and labs, drawn by the commotion. We were a small, terrified herd, huddling together in the crimson-lit hallway. There was Petrov, his face still disturbingly smooth, his eyes vacant. Davies, a hot-headed structural engineer, was already sweating, his gaze darting from face to face. Chen was trembling, muttering to himself, his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance. "This station is compromised," Thorne announced, trying to project an authority his trembling hands betrayed. "Something from down there, and it followed us back. It's a psychological attack. It's trying to divide us." "It's not an attack," Aris countered, her voice sharp and brittle. She held up her tablet. "It's a process. A physical law we didn't know existed. I've been analyzing the sensor data from our descent, cross-referencing it with the station's environmental logs, the glitches, the temporal displacement in the mirror. It's not random, it's a waveform, a cancellation wave. The two stations, the original and the copy, our station, are occupying the same quantum state. The universe doesn't allow for such redundancy. The state is collapsing. One version is overwriting the other." "So what are we supposed to do?" Davies demanded, his voice bordering on a shout. "Just sit here and get overwritten?" "We need to identify the variables," Aris said, her eyes burning with a chilling, obsessive light. "Some of us are experiencing more degradation than others. Petrov's symptoms are the most advanced. We need to quantify it, isolate the source of the corruption. It's possible this isn't a wholesale erasure. It might be targeting the weakest points first, the most unstable elements of the copy." A cold silence fell over the group. We all understood what she was implying. This was no longer a crew. We were a set of variables in a horrifying equation, and some of us were about to be solved for. The existential witch hunt had begun. "That's insane," Lena whispered. "You want to start pointing fingers? Deciding who is more real than someone else?" "I want to survive," Aris snapped. "And science is the only tool we have left. I've devised a diagnostic, a simple test of cognitive and emotional response. The original state, that place of silence and dust, is devoid of complexity. It stands to reason that the parts of our reality that are most complex, most chaotically human, would be the most resilient to its simplifying influence." Thorne, seeing his authority slipping away into Aris's cold logic, made a decision. "Do it," he commanded. "Everyone to the briefing room. We will submit to Dr. Thorne's diagnostic." The next few hours were a surreal, claustrophobic nightmare. One by one, we were called into the briefing room. The main lights were still out, the room lit only by the eerie glow of Aris's tablet and a few battery-powered lanterns. She would ask a series of questions, her voice clinical and detached. She showed us images on her screen, a beautiful sunset, a car crash, a picture of a laughing child, and monitored our biosigns, our pupillary response, the minute electrical signals in our skin. She was trying to measure our souls. The paranoia was a poison gas seeping into every corner of the station. When Davies came out of his test, he looked at Chen with open hostility. "He was in there for twice as long as I was," Davies snarled to another crew member. "They asked him the same question 3 times, he couldn't answer." The degradation was accelerating. It was no longer subtle. I was trying to get the backup generator online, but physics had become a petulant, uncooperative child. I dropped a wrench, and it hovered in the air for a full 2 seconds before clattering to the floor. The sound it made was wrong, a dull, flat thud without any echo or resonance, as if it had fallen onto a bed of that black dust. I tried to open a service conduit, a panel I'd opened 100 times, only to find a solid, seamless sheet of metal behind it. The station was actively resisting repair. It was healing itself into the featureless, non-functional state of its original self. Lena's condition had worsened. She cornered me in a corridor, her eyes wide with a horror that was beyond tears. She held out her arm. "Feel it, Elias," she pleaded. I hesitated, then touched her forearm. My fingers slid across her skin. It was perfectly unnaturally smooth. There were no pores, no tiny hairs, no imperfections. It felt like polished marble, cool and inert. "It's spreading," she whispered, her voice catching. I'm losing my texture." The horror was not in being changed into a monster. The horror was in being changed into nothing. We were being simplified, sanded down, edited out. I finally realized the full, terrifying truth while I was in the server room, trying to bypass the comms blackout. I had managed to get a single terminal running on emergency power, hoping to find a system log that would explain the communication failure. The screen flickered to life, and I ran a deep-level diagnostic on the station's core operating system. Lines of code scrolled past, mostly error messages, and then I saw it. A single repeating line, deep in the system's kernel, a process that was running constantly in the background. Process ID 001, Kuarup Station, X, Process ID 02, Kuarup Station. XE copy system conflict, redundant process detected initiating. Purge process IDMO 2. My blood turned to ice water. Aris was right, but she was also wrong. It wasn't about who was the most real among us. The entire station, our entire reality, every single one of us was process ID 002. We were the copy. The fissure hadn't revealed an alien city. It had opened a file directory and found a duplicate. And the system, in its cold binary logic, was deleting the extraneous file. The Echo Station wasn't invading us. It was absorbing us, reclaiming the data that had been anomalously duplicated. This wasn't a battle. It was system maintenance. My revelation was interrupted by a scream from the main corridor. I ran out to find the remaining crew gathered near the central hub. The object of their terror was Chen. He was on his knees, clawing at his own face, his breath coming in ragged, terrified sobs. Aris stood nearby, her tablet in hand, her face grim. His emotional responses are flatlining, she said, her voice devoid of any pity. His biosigns are becoming simplified. He's the one. He's the furthest along. He's not a disease, Lena shouted, rushing to Chen's side. He's a person. He's terrified. I'm not real, Chen sobbed, looking up at us. His face was a blurry, unfinished thing, the features seeming to shift and smear at the edges of my vision. I can't remember my mother's face. I try to picture it, and there's just a blank. A smooth, empty space. It's erasing me. Davies, his face contorted with fear and rage, took a step towards him. Get away from him. It's contagious. Suddenly, Chen stopped sobbing. He looked up, a strange, terrifying calm settling over his smudged features. I'm a copy, he said, his voice the same flat monotone as Petrov's. A copy must be erased. He stood up, and then he ran. He sprinted down the corridor towards the main airlock, moving with a desperate, preternatural speed. Stop him! Thorne yelled, but it was too late. Chen slammed his hand on the emergency release for the outer door. With a groaning hiss, the massive door slid open, revealing the swirling, white chaos of the Antarctic blizzard outside. Without a suit, without any protection, Chen ran out into the storm. We rushed to the main observatory window, which looked out onto the area in front of the airlock. The blizzard was a raging wall of white, but we could see him. A lone, dark figure stumbling through the gale. He took 10, maybe 15 steps, and then he flickered, like a bad television signal. For a split second, his form became transparent, and we could see the swirling snow right through him. He flickered again, more violently this time. He stopped walking and turned to look back at the station, his featureless face an unreadable mask of despair or acceptance. And then he was gone. He didn't explode. He didn't fade away. He just ceased to be. One moment he was there, a man being ripped apart by the wind. The next, there was nothing but the driving snow, a subtraction from the universe. We stared, speechless, into the blizzard. The snow was already covering his tracks, but the tracks stopped abruptly, 15 steps from the airlock. There was no body, no sign of a struggle, nothing. Just a set of footprints that led from our world to a final, definitive, and absolute nowhere. The first of us had been deleted. And the system was still running. Chen's deletion broke something in our collective psyche. The theoretical horror had become a practical, observable fact. We were not just dying, we were being unwritten. The silence that fell in the observatory was a new kind of silence, deeper and more hollow than the voids that had been plaguing us. It was the sound of 7 people staring at a fresh, raw amputation, not on a body, but on the fabric of existence itself. The immediate aftermath was a schism, a violent tearing of our already frayed unity. The group fractured into 2 desperate opposing philosophies. On one side was Aris. Chen's erasure, far from horrifying her, had perversely validated her brutal hypothesis. She saw it not as a death, but as a data point. "It's a cascading failure," she explained, her voice sharp and unnervingly steady as we stood by the window. The image of Chen's vanishing act burned into our retinas. "The system is purging the most corrupted files first, the ones with the least informational density." Chen's emotional state was degraded. His memories were becoming null sets. He was a less complex version of himself, closer to the baseline state of the original. The system erased him because he was the easiest to resolve. Our only chance is to prove that we are too complex to be deleted. We have to reinforce our own reality. Our memories, our emotions, our quirks. They are our armor. On the other side was Davies, the engineer. His fear had curdled into a furious, paranoid survivalism. He saw a predator, not a process. "Armor? Are you insane?" he spat, his face pale with sweat. "That thing is picking us off one by one. This isn't a system crash, it's a hunt. That one copy is down there as a cuckoo in the nest and it's pushing us out. Our only chance is to destroy it. Sever the connection. Blow the whole damn fissure to hell." Thorne, our commander, was a ghost. Chen's disappearance had shattered his military resolve, leaving a hollowed-out man grappling with a problem that couldn't be solved with a gun. He just stood there, his pistol hanging limply in his hand, his eyes lost in the swirling snow outside. He was no longer leading, he was simply witnessing the end. And me? I was caught in the terrifying middle. My discovery in the server room, the lines of code that defined us as Process ED02, confirmed Aris's cold, mechanical view of our predicament. But my heart screamed Davies's tune. I wanted to fight, I wanted to break the mirror, not study my reflection in it as I faded away. My mind knew it was system maintenance, but my gut felt the malice of an executioner. The station itself was now actively coming apart at the seams. It was no longer our home, it was a dreamscape collapsing in on itself. I was in the workshop, looking for demolition charges for Davies's desperate plan, when I saw it. I reached for a heavy-duty power conduit on a shelf. As my fingers got within an inch of it, the conduit dissolved into a cascade of the fine, black, massless dust, which then rained to the floor and vanished. It wasn't just fading from view. Its physical form was being de-instantiated, its data packet deleted. The physics of our reality were becoming suggestions rather than laws. Corridors would randomly connect to different parts of the station. Opening the door to the mess hall might lead you to the laundry room. A walk that should have taken 30 seconds could stretch into a 10-minute journey through a geometrically impossible space. Gravity itself became unreliable. Pockets of near-zero G would appear without warning, leaving us floating for a few terrifying seconds before slamming us back to the deck. It was like living inside a corrupted video game file, with the world clipping and glitching around us. Aris's faction, which consisted of herself and Lena, who had reluctantly concluded that Aris's horrifying theory was the only one that fit the facts, barricaded themselves in the science lab. They began a frantic, desperate attempt to reinforce their reality. They covered the walls with personal photographs, played music loaded with emotional significance, and recited childhood memories to each other like a catechism. They were trying to make themselves informationally dense, too complex and messy for the great cosmic deletion algorithm. Davies, along with Petrov and myself, formed the other camp. Petrov, whose degradation had seemed to plateau, leaving him in a state of perpetually smooth-faced, monotone detachment, was a surprisingly effective ally. He no longer felt fear, so he could perform tasks with a calm, robotic efficiency. Our goal was simple and brutal: get to the station's main reactor core and trigger a catastrophic overload. The idea was that the resulting explosion, a massive, uncontrolled release of energy, would be powerful enough to not only vaporize our station, but also collapse the fissure and destroy the original, severing the quantum link between the two realities. It was a suicide mission, but it felt like the only way to take control, to die on our own terms rather than being edited out of existence. The final confrontation happened in the twisting, unreliable heart of the station. To get to the reactor control room, we had to pass through the central hub, which was adjacent to the science lab. As we approached, a door slid open, and Iris stood there, blocking our path. Her face was gaunt, her eyes wild, but there was a fierce, defiant energy radiating from her. "Stop," she commanded. "You can't do this." "Get out of our way, Iris," Davies growled, hefting a large hydro spanner like a club. "We're ending this." "You'll end nothing," she retorted, her voice rising. "You'll only accelerate the process. A massive energy release? That's the opposite of complexity. It's a simplification. You'd be handing the system exactly what it wants. A neat, tidy resolution. You'll be helping it erase us." "It's better than sitting around waiting to fade away while singing nursery rhymes," I shot back, the anger and fear a bitter taste in my mouth. As we argued, the world around us began to stutter. The emergency lights flickered violently. A section of the corridor wall beside us dissolved into black dust, revealing the swirling polar storm outside for a brief, gut-wrenching moment before shimmering back into existence. The fabric of our bubble of reality was tearing. Suddenly a new voice joined the argument. It was a calm, flat monotone. Petrov. He had moved past us and was now standing directly in front of Iris. "Your hypothesis is flawed, Doctor," he stated, his unfinished face an unreadable mask. "You assume complexity as a defense. The system does not seek the path of least resistance. It seeks total resolution. It will not skip the complex files. It will simply take longer to process their deletion." Iris stared at him, her intellectual certainty for the first time wavering. How do you know that?" Petrov tilted his head, a gesture that was unnervingly inhuman. "I am less cluttered now. I can perceive the process more clearly. The connection between the two states, it is not an attack, it is a reconciliation, a convergence. And it is inevitable." He then did something none of us could have predicted. With a smooth, efficient motion, he reached out and shoved Iris back into the science lab, then slapped the emergency lockdown panel on the outside. A heavy steel door slammed shut, sealing Iris and Lena inside. "What are you doing?" Davies shouted. "The doctor's activities are creating informational noise," Petrov said calmly. "It is interfering with the final convergence. This is more efficient." He then turned and started walking towards the reactor room. "The plan to overload the core is logical. Mutual annihilation is a form of resolution." Davies and I looked at each other, horrified. We had created a monster not of malice, but of pure, unfeeling logic. Petrov was no longer on our side. He was on the side of the system. He was an agent of the purge. We raced after him. The path to the reactor room was a nightmare. A stairwell had inverted, forcing us to climb down to go up. A corridor looped back on itself, a frustrating, non-Euclidean trap that we only escaped when the wall randomly dissolved and we scrambled through the opening. We finally burst into the reactor control room. It was a small chamber, dominated by a thick, reinforced window looking out onto the pulsating blue-white heart of the station's fusion core. Petrov was already at the main console, his smooth fingers flying across the keypad, initiating the overload sequence. "Petrov, stop!" I yelled, tackling him from behind. We crashed to the floor. He was surprisingly strong, his movements economical and precise. Davies joined the fray, trying to pry his hands away from the console. As we wrestled, a klaxon began to blare, a deafening, rhythmic scream that signaled the start of the core overload. Red lights flashed everywhere. The whole room vibrated with the rising power of the dying reactor. I managed to push Petrov away. Davies held him down. I scrambled back to the console, my mind racing as I tried to remember the abort sequence. It was a complex series of commands designed to be foolproof. My fingers flew across the keypad, but the physics of the station had one last cruel trick to play. I hit the final command key. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the screen in front of me flickered. The abort sequence I had typed vanished, replaced by a single stark line of text. Command override. Purge in progress. My blood froze. The klaxon continued to blare. From the corner of my eye, I saw Petrov stop struggling. He lay on the floor under Davies, a strange, serene look on his featureless face. "Convergence is at hand," he whispered in his flat, dead voice. I turned to run, to try to escape the inevitable, a futile animal instinct. And I stopped. I was facing the reinforced glass wall of the control room. It was a perfect dark mirror, and it reflected nothing. I was looking straight at it, but there was no image of me. The glass reflected the flashing red lights of the room, the console behind me, Davies wrestling with Petrov on the floor, but the space where I should have been was empty. It was a perfect, clear view of the wall behind me. I held up my hands in front of my face. They were becoming transparent. I could see the console through the flesh of my palms. The purge had finally reached me. Not with a flicker, but with a slow, terrifying fade. The klaxon screamed. The reactor whined as it climbed towards meltdown, and I stood there watching myself become a ghost just moments before the end of my world. The klaxon was the sound of the world ending, a shrill, pulsating shriek that hammered at the air, the walls, the very atoms of my dissolving body. I stood before the dark mirror of the reactor window, a ghost in my own machine, and watched myself cease to be. My hands were crystalline, webs of faint light through which the frantic, flashing red of the control room was perfectly visible. The process was not painful. There was no sensation at all. It was a subtraction, a quiet, administrative process of the soul. Through my fading form, I could see Davies, his face a mask of raw animal terror, still struggling with Petrov. But Petrov was no longer fighting back. He lay on the floor, his unfinished face turned towards the pulsing blue-white heart of the reactor, an expression of serene finality on his smooth features. He was a pilgrim who had finally reached his shrine. My first instinct, a deeply ingrained animal reflex, was to scream. I opened my mouth, gathered the air in my lungs, or what was left of them, and pushed. No sound emerged. The scream was a phantom, a silent electrical impulse that dissipated into the roaring chaos of the room. My voice had already been deleted. The vibration from the overloaded core intensified, shaking the entire station. I could feel the deck plates shivering, not through the soles of my feet, but as a distant, abstract concept of vibration. The light from the core window grew, shifting from brilliant blue-white to an angry, impossible violet. This was it, the end. A final, defiant roar of energy that would wipe both copies from the slate. A shared annihilation. It was the only victory we had left. And then the klaxon faltered. It didn't stop. It stuttered, the piercing shrieks becoming distorted, elongated, like a recording on a dying battery. The rhythmic pulse slowed, each beat a drawn-out, groaning gasp. The flashing red emergency lights flickered, dimmed, and then died one by one, plunging the room into a deep, oppressive gloom, lit only by the violet death glow of the reactor. The vibration lessened. The high-pitched whine of the core began to descend in pitch, a long, pathetic slide down the scale from a scream to a moan, then to a hum, and then nothing. The final light in the reactor window flickered, held for a moment, and then winked out. The explosion never came. Our final desperate act of defiance, our suicide pact with reality, had failed. It had fizzled out, neutered by the very laws we were trying to exploit. How can a reactor melt down when the fundamental principles of thermodynamics are being systematically erased? How can you create a fire when the concept of combustion is being deleted from the source code? Our grand, defiant gesture was a lit match in a vacuum. In the sudden, absolute darkness, a new sound became apparent. It was the sound of the station dying, not in an explosion, but in a slow, final exhalation. The hum of the ventilation, the thrum of the reserve power, the soft electronic chatter of 100 dormant systems, the lifeblood of Quarup Station that I had tended for years, all of it faded away. It was a symphony of cessation, each sound winking out of existence until only one remained, the ragged, terrified breathing of Davies. Then a new light bloomed in the room. Not the harsh technological light of our world, but a soft, cold, ambient luminescence that seemed to emanate from the very walls. It was a grey, featureless light, the light of a world without a sun. In this new, perpetual twilight, I saw the scene with a clarity that was no longer dependent on my eyes. I was no longer in my body. The last vestiges of my physical form had evaporated, but my consciousness remained. I was a floating, disembodied point of view, untethered from flesh and bone. I was pure awareness, and I could see everything. Davies had scrambled away from Petrov and was huddled in a corner, his breath coming in shuddering, panicked sobs. Petrov lay on the floor, unmoving. He wasn't dead. The concept of death felt too complex. He was simply resolved, a completed equation. His form was still there, but it was like a sculpture carved from that same featureless black material as the Echo Station, a human-shaped hole in the world. Slowly, as if in a dream, I drifted out of the control room. The station was transformed. The strobing chaos was gone, replaced by this silent, grey, tomb-like stillness. The corridors were stable now, the geometry fixed. There were no more glitches. The system had finished debugging. I floated towards the science lab. The heavy steel door was still sealed. I passed through it as if it was smoke. Inside, the scene was frozen. Aris and Lena were there. Lena was on the floor, curled in a fetal position, her hands over her head. Her skin was a perfect, unbroken sheet of polished white, like an unpainted mannequin. Aris was standing before a wall she had covered in equations and personal photographs, a desperate last stand of complexity against the encroaching simplicity. Her hand was outstretched, about to touch a picture of her as a child, but she was motionless. Both of them were statues of white and grey, their forms perfectly detailed, but utterly devoid of life, colour or texture. They were like 3D models with the final render cancelled, leaving only the wireframe of what they once were. They hadn't been erased like Chen. They had been finalized, archived. I finally understood. Aris had been wrong. Petrov had been right. Complexity wasn't a shield. It was just a bigger file to process. The system wasn't deleting the data. It was converting it, taking our chaotic, noisy, vibrant existence and reformatting it to its own silent, orderly, and eternal standard. Annihilation would have been a mercy. This was cataloging. With this new, untethered perception, I could feel the truth of it. The original, the cold, silent reality that had been waiting beneath the ice, wasn't a place or an entity. It was the universe's default state. It was the canvas. Life, chaos, warmth, noise, love, grief, all of it was just accidental. Temporary paint splattered on its surface. We weren't a bug. We were an unauthorized artwork. A brief, beautiful, and chaotic scrawl on a pristine surface. The fissure hadn't been an attack. It was simply the canvas tearing, revealing its own true nature beneath the thin layer of pigment. And now, the canvas was methodically, dispassionately cleaning itself. My consciousness was drawn through the silent station, a tour of my own mausoleum. I saw the other crew members, frozen in their final moments of terror or confusion, all of them now perfect, silent statues, part of the new, permanent exhibit. The station was no longer Quarup. It had fully become the Echo. The copy had been seamlessly reintegrated with the original. I was pulled towards the comms room. The room was dark, but as I drifted in, the main communications console flickered to life, bathed in that same cold, grey light. I was not controlling this. I was merely an observer, a passenger inside the ghost that was now the station itself. On the main screen, a single progress bar appeared. Reconciliation complete. All anomalies resolved. Then, a new command line appeared. Initiating universal broadcast, the correction. The system began to transmit. It wasn't a message of conquest or a cry of victory. There were no words, no images, no data. It was a single, pure, unwavering carrier wave. The broadcast was the sound of the original state. It was the sound of absolute zero, the sound of a thoughtless, eternal, perfect peace. It was the sound of silence, and as it broadcast, I felt its purpose. It was a template, a patch for the rest of the universe. It was a signal that carried the fundamental truth, that the chaotic accident of life was an error to be corrected. It was a quiet, patient instruction on how to return to the pristine, silent state. It was the most dangerous thing in the history of the cosmos, and it was being offered as a gift. My awareness, my sense of I, was beginning to fray at the edges. My thoughts were losing their sharpness, my memories fading from vibrant colors to shades of gray. I was a drop of ink dissolving in an infinite ocean of clear water. The grief for Sarah, the ache that had defined me for so long, was the last thing to go. It was the most complex, chaotic, and irrational part of me, and therefore the last piece of the unauthorized painting to be wiped clean. I was no longer Elias Vance. I was becoming a memory, a piece of archived data filed away in the silent library of this place. I was a mote of the black dust, a non-existent thing that held the ghost of a story. Before the last of my consciousness dissolved into the great, calm stillness, I had one final, coherent thought. It wasn't a thought of anger, or fear, or sadness. It was a thought of pure, crystalline, and terrible understanding. We hadn't found a strange city under the ice. We had found the truth of the universe, and the truth is that the universe is a tomb, and we hadn't just opened the door. We had taught it how to knock on all the others. Our world wasn't the first to be corrected. We were just the first to broadcast the instructions on how to do it to everyone else. The silence is coming. The silence is everything, and it should have been left buried.